University of Glasgow and the Adam Smith Business School, I'm very, very pleased to welcome you to this fabulous event, a series of joint events we will be organizing as part of the schools and the university COP26 program. As a world-changing university, we have put climate at the core of our agenda. And in fact, we have been among the first UK universities to commit to carbon neutrality by 2030. Today, on the opportunity of the city hosting the COP26, an important moment which might define the history, the future history of our planet, as a school and as a university, we'd like to seize the opportunity to fulfill two missions: to raise the public understanding of climate change in communities, in schools, in the city and the nation, and the impacts it has on societies and the humanity in general. To identify the trade-offs, the costs and benefits of the transition to net zero, and to help policymakers to make the best choices. But we also want to further educate the generation of future leaders to develop a stronger culture of corporate responsibility that contributes to sustainability goals in the organizations and the communities they will be leading. So today, I would like to welcome our distinguished speakers who have been so generous with their time. They come from all parts of the world. They have great track records in influencing policy, in making contributions to academia, to policy, to communities, to societies. They come from the academia, from the private sector, from NGOs. We have Nobel Prize winners and policymakers to come together to share invaluable insights on how economies can finance a sustainable transition to net zero. I'm also very, very happy to be announcing our partnership with the Reinventing the Bretton Woods Committee, a great organization that facilitates a deep dialogue among high-level stakeholders and impactful policymakers, and brings together a wealth of expertise that can help us understand what the transition means. Marc, I will hand this over to you now to say a few words. Thank you very much all for coming here today.
Thank you, John, and good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome all our speakers, panelists, moderators, but also the audience that will be joining us during the day for this conference entitled The Aftermath of the Post-COVID Era, Embracing the Net Zero Global Economy. It has been a great pleasure to work with the University of Glasgow and the Adam Smith Business School to start this first program and this first initiative, and to try to lay out maybe some important foundation moving forward for the future of the global economy. Just as the pandemic has shown that we can no longer ignore health precautions, we can no longer afford to ignore climate change. We focus on climate change today because it is macro-critical, posing profound threats to growth and prosperity. We all know an economy-wide transition to net zero is a huge task, but our experience with COVID-19 has powerfully demonstrated our ability to adapt. One of the most fundamental reforms of the 21st century in the international financial system was the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944. The architect didn't wait for the Second World War to end to determine what the future should look like, and thereby tackle problems that had beset the interwar year period. There are two strong messages from Bretton Woods that we should have at the front of our mind today. Let's not wait for today's problem to be over before setting the course for the future. And once again, we will need a multilateral approach. The Bretton Woods Agreement was not easy to reach, and there were costs attached to it, which has to be met. But it lays a platform for a sustained recovery from a terrible crisis. Similarly, today, climate is a common global risk, and we cannot hope to insulate ourselves through domestic action alone. In order to navigate these troubled waters, more holistic perspectives become essential to coordinate central bank, multilateral development banks, regulators, supervisors, in order for this player to work with government. This is precisely the spirit of the conference today. We are going to have 4 important sessions that will start here in a couple of minutes with the first session that will be chaired by Professor Carter, a new sustainable economic and financial system for securing a net zero future for the global economy. That will be followed by another session entitled Macroeconomic Impact of Climate Change, a case for green recovery from the COVID pandemic, followed by Climate Change and the Reshaping of Finance, and to conclude with some, hopefully, public policy actions, the potential role of public policy in sustainable finance. So a long program with many stakeholders, many policymakers, academic, private sector. I think we bring really a different group of stakeholders. And this is hopefully the first of a series that we would like to encore with you, John, and your colleagues. It has been also a great privilege to work together. I want to take also this opportunity to thank all you staff and colleagues, particularly Soner, Claire Taylor, and her team to put all of this conference together today. Thank you very much. And I give the floor back, I think, to Soner, who I think will say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marc. Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much for all of you who spent your precious times participating in our event. We are very happy to have very distinguished line of speakers talking about different dimensions of how climate will be the part of transition to a greener, to a livable world. Paris 2015 has given lots of commitments, and now Glasgow is the time to put everything into flesh and bone. And one of the pressing issues is how finance will play part in this transition. So I won't spend too much time because we have a fantastic line of speakers, but today's discussion will be about this important topic. We will be very pleased to see public sector perspectives, private sector perspectives, and also big macro picture about how climate finance can shape the economic environment, financial environment, and how the interplay between the economics, finance, and climate change will be seen. Before giving floor to the speakers of the first session, I also want to thank all the speakers who are with us today, and also all the audience who are with us today, and also the organizing team, the business school event team, in particular Claire Taylor and other colleagues in the organization team. We are very happy to have you here, and we are very looking forward to the discussions today.
Okay, let's make a start. So welcome everyone to the first session of today's event. We're very grateful to 4 great speakers that are joining us today from different parts of the world. As far as I understand, 3 of them are in Italy. The title of the session is A New Sustainable Economic and Financial System for Securing a Net Zero Future for the Global Economy. Our speakers are Tim Gould, who is the Chief Economist of the International Energy Agency. Tim provides strategic advice on energy economics across a wide range of the IEA activities and analysis. He's also the head of the Division for Energy Supply and Investment Outlooks. In that capacity, he co-leads the World Energy Outlook and oversees the agency's work on investment and finance. Our next speaker on the program is Michael Spence. Professor Spence is currently the Professor Emeritus and Dean at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. Professor Spence obviously has had many contributions in the field of economics and elsewhere, and he's noted for his job market signaling model, which had an impact on many theoretical and applied fields in economics. As a recognition to this pioneering work, he has received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2001. He's also the chairman of the Independent Commission on Growth and Development, an international body from the 2016, analyzing opportunities for global economic growth, and an author of The Next Convergence, The Future of Economic Growth in a Multi-Speed World. Michael is an expert on poverty reduction. He's writing regularly on pressing issues, including climate change and topics related to sustainable growth. Our next speaker on the program is Simone Borghesi. Now, Simone, as far as I know, is also joining us from Italy today. Simone is professor of Simone is the director of FSR Climate, the research group at the Robert Schuman Center at the European University Institute, and a professor of economics at the University of Siena. He's the president of the Italian Association on Environmental and Resource Economists. He's also a Secretary General of the Policy Outreach Committee, the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economists. His main areas are globalization and sustainable development, European climate and energy policies, the European emission trading system, growth and environmental degradation, among other things. And our last speaker for today is Professor Chung, who is the chairman of the Global Energy Prize International Award Committee, a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and an emeritus professor at Incheon National University, Songdo. Professor Zhang was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2007, and he's one of the leading advocates of the low carbon green growth as a new paradigm to sustain growth and job creation while coping with the rest of climate change. He's also the former climate change ambassador of Korea and director of Environment and Development Division of the United Nations and Director General for International Economic Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Korea. Professor Zhang has been involved and is involved in global climate debates since the drafting of the first agreement and until the Paris Agreement on climate change in 2015. So we're looking forward to great insights for our panel of speakers. I will invite our speakers to begin their presentation. We'll go by the order of announcements. So Tim, if you can please start first.
Thank you very much indeed for the chance to speak with you today. I hope you can see my slides on the screen. I'm trying to make them full screen. It's a huge pleasure to talk with you. What I would like to do is to, in a sense, set the scene from an energy perspective and to give us a stock take of where we've reached in the transition to a net zero energy system, how much more we need to do, and the sorts of questions, some of the questions that might raise about the interactions between the energy sector and the broader economy. In fact, I returned recently from Glasgow yesterday, in fact, still very much focused on the discussions there, but also watching very closely what is happening in energy markets. We've seen a very large run up in prices for oil, natural gas, coal, and that raises all sorts of questions about whether or not we are likely to see an orderly transition to a low emissions economy. But I would like to come back to all those points during the course of my presentation. But first, a quick stock take on where we are in energy transitions. If we cast our mind back a few years, to before the conclusion of the Paris Agreement, our expectation for what comes next was very clear: steady increase in CO2 emissions, the world continuing to rely heavily on fossil fuels. And as the IPCC's work has demonstrated very, very convincingly, that would have led to catastrophic climate change. However, since Paris, new policies, technology costs for clean energy have fallen. And with the policy settings that we now have in place around the world and the technologies that are coming to the market, we see a stabilization in global emissions ahead. Let's have in mind, a stabilization of global emissions at a high level is a long way from a stabilization in global temperature rise. And that's one of the reasons why the Paris Agreement makes it very clear that countries need to ratchet up their ambitions over time. And of course, that's what we're observing in the run-up to Glasgow, and indeed at Glasgow itself, with updated nationally determined contributions and various long-term pledges to net zero emissions. So what we wanted to do in our most recent World Energy Outlook is to ask ourselves, what would happen if all of those new pledges were met in time and in full? What would be the implications? And this is where we ended up, or rather, this is where we ended up when we looked at the beginning of October. Since then, we've had a raft of additional pledges from India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Indonesia, Russia, Australia, that again, if we take governments at their word, and if all of those things were implemented in full, that would bring this line down further than you see on the screen today. But the essential point remains, if you give governments the benefit of the doubt and assume that pledges are implemented, that's quite a large if, but if you do that, then we have a turning point in prospect over the coming decades. The global economy continues to grow. Global energy demand in total flattens after 2030, and emissions fall by at least 40% to 2050. That doesn't get us to a Paris compliant outcome, but it's nonetheless significant. Emissions have grown in every decade since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and we are now looking at the prospect of a parting of the ways between those trends for the economy, energy demand, and CO2 emissions. And this turning point, not yet enough to tackle climate change in line with Paris, but nonetheless, some quite strong implications for energy markets. So if you just look at today's policy settings, near-term future looks a lot like a past. Looks a lot like the past. But if you factor in the implications of those announced pledges, you start to see some trend breaks, continued growth in renewables, but already by 2025, a flattening in the global oil demand outlook and then a decline. Key reason for that would be the accelerated pace of sales of electric vehicles, similar trajectory for natural gas at global level, largely due to changes in the electricity sector. And of course, there would also be very strong implications for coal, the most carbon intensive of the fuels. Finance for new coal plants is becoming increasingly scarce, especially after the announcement by President Xi Jinping that China would not build new coal-fired power plants abroad anymore. However, still a long way to go to get us to a trajectory that would be consistent with a 1.5 degree stabilization in rising global temperatures. And I wanted to say a few words on what more needs to be done to close that gap. So we found in our analysis, particularly focusing on the crucial date of 2030, that there's an awful lot more that could be done that is very cost effective to close that, what you might call an ambition gap in 2030. And I wanted to focus just on the things that in our view, where there's no economic rationale for holding back, because you get cost reductions for consumers as a result of taking additional measures. I mean, that's part of the reason why we find it difficult to understand why some of these measures are not on the table in Glasgow. So what are these additional elements? First and foremost, additional boost to deployment of low-cost wind and solar PV, as well as other low-emission sources of electricity. That's the single most important measure to close the gap with a 1.5 degree trajectory. Another very cost-effective approach that's been in the news the last few days, bring down methane emissions from fossil fuel operations. Methane, a very potent greenhouse gas, and the energy sector, in particular, oil and gas operations, have to be in the front line of bringing down that source of emissions. And that can, I think, in our view, can be done also quite quickly. Similarly, for energy efficiency, there's lots of cost-effective potential to improve performance in this area, as well as opportunities to push electrification even harder. I think we'd make a distinction, though, between the near-term agenda to 2030, when the technologies that we can deploy are mature, and then some of the things that would need to be done after 2030, when we still need to innovate, because in our view, a full transition to net zero emissions by 2050, it will require more than the tools that we have available today, especially require tackling emissions in sectors like long distance transportation, heavy industries, where abatement is much more difficult. So as you can see on the screen, some of the technologies that we think we will need to reach full net zero 2050, they are still not commercial. So they're still at the demonstration or even prototype phase. And I can give you some examples of on the screen of the sorts of things that we have in mind. Things like advanced battery designs that can provide a step change in energy density and open the possibility to electrify heavy duty trucks. We will need to successfully demonstrate CCUS in the cement industry to address process emissions. Similarly, we'll need carbon removal technologies, such as direct air capture, to offset residual emissions and helps to advance the date of full global net zero. I wanted to conclude these opening remarks with a couple of additional observations. One, to look at some of those changes that I've been talking about in the energy system through the prism of international trade. As I'm sure you're aware, value of this trade today is dominated by oil. However, there are important new elements that we now need to track systematically, and particularly the bottom right-hand corner of that quadrant, the critical minerals that we need for a range of clean energy technologies. Today, that's dominated by the copper that's used for electricity grids and other electrical applications. But there's a rising importance of lithium, cobalt, nickel for batteries, some rare earth elements that are very important also for clean energy technologies. If we move to 2050, in a scenario that assumes that all of those announced pledges are implemented, oil retains a predominant role still, but patterns of trade by then are quite different. But there's some new kids on the block. You can start to see low carbon hydrogen, hydrogen-rich fuels coming into the picture. And most countries have the potential to make hydrogen domestically, but production costs vary widely. So there are incentives to trade. As a result, we start to see exports of hydrogen and hydrogen-rich fuels such as ammonia, mostly into Northeast Asia, from Australia, some countries in the Middle East and Latin America. In the net zero emissions scenario, so by 2050, the current dynamics of international energy-related trade completely overturned. And naturally, this kind of rapid energy transition would have dramatic implications for economies that rely heavily today on hydrocarbon revenue. And a final set of remarks on investment. As you can imagine, as the IEA, we watch very closely for mismatches between investment in different parts of the energy sector and what we think will be required in future. And this concern that we have is now becoming quite acute. In the case of oil and gas, upstream investment is half of what it was in 2014, while oil and gas demand, of course, even with the effects of the pandemic, has not changed to anything like the same extent. The industry today is kind of leaner and fitter than it was. Upstream operations are much more efficient. But still, if we benchmark that investment that's going into the upstream today with the amount that's required in a net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, we see that it is reasonably well aligned. And you could conclude from that today's spending on oil and gas production is kind of geared towards a future in which consumption of oil and gas is stagnant or even in decline. But if we look at what's happening in markets today, you can see that that's not the world that we are in for the moment. Oil and gas consumption is still increasing. So there's a mismatch there that is very important for us to have in mind. And if we look at the other side of the ledger, as it were, so spending on clean energy and infrastructure, that has been much more resilient through today's crisis, and we're expecting another uptick in 2021. but it is well short of where we would need to be in that net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, so a 1.5 degree scenario. And the shortfall is particularly visible in emerging and developing economies outside China, and I'm sure that's a point that we will come back to later. So the mismatch that you're looking at on the screen, it creates clear risks for the future. We are not investing enough in energy transitions in order to meet rising demand for energy services in a sustainable way. That is also the gap that needs to be filled. The way forward is clear, major boost in clean energy investment. But while the mismatch that you're looking at the screen remains unresolved, there will remain a strong risk of further sharp price swings and increased volatility in the future. So in our discussions today and in all our deliberations, we should be very aware of the possibility of a disorderly and disjointed transition to a net zero global economy. And with that, I will conclude my remarks and look forward very much to hear from my fellow speakers and from the rest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was very illuminating, a great stock take of where we are. Next in line, we have Professor Michael Spence. Michael, we're ready for you when you are.
Well, thank you very much, John, and I want to thank Tim for a really excellent presentation on where we are. That I just thought that was terrific. And so I I had prepared some remarks, and I don't have graphs, but I'm going to go out of order because I think the last set of points that Tim made are really important. So I was going to talk about the energy transition in much the same way. I mean, we have a mammoth job in shifting to non-carbon sources of energy. We've got an energy efficiency agenda. We probably have a carbon capture and direct reduction agenda on the one side, but we're in a multi-decade transition. And so going in with the mindset that, you know, the sort of the CO2 carbon-based energy sources are sort of bad news is not a very helpful mindset when you go into that. And it will lead, as Tim said, to something that we're already seeing in markets, which is a kind of a poorly developed, unbalanced plan, you know, for phasing out the carbon-based emissions while we expand and grow the non-carbon-based emissions. And the problem with that is that it produces more than is necessary in terms of disruption of economic growth. But then the consequence of that is that people become skeptical in a way that's unnecessary if this is done properly. So skeptical about the whole energy transition. So, and then, you know, then you start to lose the kind of momentum that's been generated in the past decade, and certainly is evident in Glasgow. So I think the bottom line is that, just to underline what Tim said, we really need, having sort of rounded the corner on making the case that something dramatic is about to happen, and we need an aggressive set of plans. We also need balanced plans, and so activities in the financial sector that sound like you can't invest in fossil fuels is not a helpful part of that. The rest of my remarks are, I think, they're a little bit scattered, but as John said, I've spent a fair amount of time in developing countries, and there are enormous distributional issues associated with the climate, challenge and with the energy transition. So let me just make a few remarks along those lines. The pandemic economy has been something of a disaster in distributional terms, both domestically in most economies, but especially in the global economy. So that they develop a significant fraction of the developing world, a subset of middle income countries and virtually all the lower income countries went into this with limited medical resources, limited fiscal space and financial resources. And the vaccine rollout, which could have truncated this, is going badly in the lower income countries. I mean, we're talking, Gordon Brown has been particularly vocal about this, but we're talking about vaccine rates in some countries in the 3 to 4% range. It's just not going to work. And so there's a major issue about the participation, the capacity to be part of this sort of major transition that we're talking about. And I think it deserves a whole lot of attention because if we just assume that everybody's going to get on board, the simple truth is that there's a significant fraction of the world that doesn't have the resources to get on board and hasn't even really, finished, entered the sort of growth spurt that we've experienced in some countries coming out of the pandemic. Second, the investment levels are eye-popping. Something on the order of $3 trillion a year is what I think that's consistent with what Tim just told us. My best guess is that that's 50-50 public and private. Once again, it's not beyond the realm of possibility. I think it's doable, but it's going to require a significant amount of cross-border investment. Let me just take an example. Solar has come down in cost in just a stunning fashion. It is now competitive with most carbon-based sources of, depending on where you are. So you might think in the developing world where they're going to build most of the energy generating, electricity generating capacity that they're going to have 50 years from now in the future, not converting stuff they already have. But then you sort of say, but solar is a capital intensive technology. And it's, so if you shift your focus to Africa, you discover the cost of capital don't look anything like the cost of capital that we have here. So once again, the institutional setups in the financial system, both on the private side and the kind of international, financial institution side, are going to need a significant upgrade in terms of available capital and mandate in order to sort of make this a global effort. This third observation I wanted to make is, I know we're sort of all in this together, and we needed all the voices participating and feeling like they're included in the process. But I did a calculation recently of what are the sources of carbon dioxide. This is gross, not net, and production-based. So I think everybody knows if you did a consumption-based version of it, it's slightly different. But if you take the US and Canada, the EU all in, the UK, Russia, China, India, and Japan, you have something like 70 to 75% of global emissions. And so my view is that lying in behind this is a sort of critical issue, which I call this the core of the problem. Not that the other people are missing in action, but it is the core of the problem. And we're in an environment where there's at least some question about whether these entities have the relationships and the intention to come together on this particular essential issue, given that there are tensions and other problems that are sort of splitting them apart. So I think so my conclusion from this, if the core can't reach an agreement, we don't have a chance. And it's going to be an uphill battle. This, in part because of domestic politics in a lot of places, to sort of bring everybody together. And I think it's important, not just because they're a big source of carbon emissions, but they're also major, when you put these all together, this is a major source of the technology that's got to spill out around the world to solve the kind of remaining part that Tim described in the last part of his presentation. And finally, I really appreciated the IPCC's rather blunt report this summer on kind of where we're at. And I interpreted that report as saying, one, there's a huge challenge in dealing with the with the climate problem, but that we're far enough down the road that we're going to have lots of climate related things to deal with. And so, while this isn't the main subject for today, if we're going to deal with increasingly severe, frequent, global severe climate events, and I think this summer was kind of an eye opener for many of us. I mean, I looked at a map and the floods, were pretty much everywhere in the world, and that's just one dimension of this. My view is that the combination of private and social insurance systems are simply not, up to the ability to deal with this much buffeting. And if they're not, then this will be a subject in part of the next panel. But there's a serious question about whether that spills over into the macroeconomic impact. I've talked to some folks at the UN, and I think there's a I guess it comes under the heading adaptation, but there's a serious question of whether or not we don't need a major upgrade, both domestically and internationally, of the sort of shock absorbers in the system that we know we're going to need in the future. So I think, John, why don't I stop there?
Thank you very much, Michael. That was greatly illuminating. I think it's fair to say the distributional impacts are potentially tremendous, and you've also identified the resource transfer that needs to happen from the wealthy core to the developing countries. So that's great. Thank you very much, Michael. Next in line, we have Simone Borghesi. Simone, your turn whenever you're ready. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me see if I manage to move it. Yes, here we are. Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure and honor to be in this panel. I would like to give my small contribution to the discussion, picking up a couple of questions that were proposed in the session description. How can we finance a sustainable transition, and with which policy tools, and how can we use them? And in doing this, I will try to provide a few insights from my own research in the field. But given the time constraints, I will focus on a specific climate policy tool, emissions trading systems, describing their role and their evolution, and the possible carbon leakage risks that might derive from their application, but also some possible solutions. So as you all know, emission trading systems are basically cap and trade systems that put a price on greenhouse gas emissions to cost effectively control and eventually eliminate emissions. The first and most prominent example of this system was certainly the European one, was born in 2005, which covers 40% of the European greenhouse gas emissions, over 10,000 heavy energy using installations in 30 countries. And the diagram on the right provides a network analysis of the system, so describes the network structure, explaining where market operators are located and active, or better, where they were located and active, because this includes Great Britain, as you see, so it's before Brexit. But following the European example, many other jurisdictions have adopted a similar approach. This diagram that is taken from ICAP shows in blue the jurisdictions where an ETS is in place, in green those that where it is under development, and in yellow those where it's under consideration. And as you see, starting from the center, from the European case, ETSs rapidly spread, both Western and Eastern, involving many countries, and are still growing. But each ETS has its own features, its own structure. And for this reason, in order to reconcile them, at the European University Institute, I'm directing a project called DCET, which stands for Deepening International Cooperation on Emissions Trading, which aims at exchanging information among the various systems and align, possibly linking them in the future. And this includes the active participation of the regulators of the main ETSs around, from the European Commission to California in China, New Zealand, Quebec, and Switzerland. Every ETS has its own features, but also its own story. The history of an ETS can be described by the evolution of carbon price. This diagram shows the evolution of the European carbon price on the EU ETS. And as you see, price fell very drastically during the financial crisis of 2007-8. Then prices remained pretty low, below 5 euros per ton of CO2 for a long time, until the end of 2017, when a new announced policy, a reform, the Market Stability Reserve, which is basically an adjustment mechanism, automatic supply adjustment mechanism to address the oversupply on the market, convinced market operators that the system was credible, and prices start growing again. And actually, despite the pandemic, kept growing above 60 euros per ton of CO2, a new record level. And similar trends emerged also in the other major ETSs that we analyzed: New Zealand in green, California and Quebec, which joined their ETSs in 2014, and so led to a unique curve, namely a unique price, and Switzerland, which joined the EU ETS at the beginning of 2020 and is rapidly converging to the European prices. So similar trends, but also large price gaps. If you look at this, the European price is 3 times the California Quebec price, for instance. It's still much higher than the New Zealand one. And the price gap is even larger if you consider the Chinese pilot projects. China started with 7 pilot projects that are represented here before moving on to the nationwide system, which is still in its infancy, if you want. And as you see, most of the prices range around 5 euros per ton of CO2, only Beijing being around 12, so very far from the rest of the group. These increasing carbon prices, but also the increasing gap across carbon prices jurisdictions raises the issue that is now getting more important, the possible international competitiveness problems that regulated entities might suffer. It is well known that unilateral policies like emission trading system may provoke carbon leakage, namely the delocalization of polluting activities towards towards jurisdictions with laxer environmental regulations. To be honest, the literature has found little or no evidence so far. But all these studies, including mine, were based on a period in which carbon prices were low. Now, new evidence might emerge as carbon prices keep rising, and especially if they are to rise to achieve the very ambitious climate neutrality target by 2050 for most jurisdictions, or later on for China and India. So this raises the question, how can we safeguard international competitiveness? And I think we have 3 options at disposal. The first and most common one is using free allowances, providing free allowances to the sectors at risk of delocalization. But we know from experience that the regulators can be too generous. Sometimes too generous criteria have been used in the past, for instance, in the European case, which led, especially at the beginning, to windfall profits and low incentive to innovation. Therefore, we need to phase out free allowances, but what's next? Well, one possibility could be the one that we study in this project, namely linking. Because as we saw, by linking emission trading, prices converge, and price convergence reduces or even eliminates the delocalization incentive. But linking raises new questions, both ex ante and ex post. Ex ante point are, what is the maximum price gap or size gap that can be acceptable across possible partners? And which features might prevent linking? For instance, if I adopt an absolute cap and you adopt a relative cap, can we still link? But there are also ex post questions. Once you are linked, because there are risks of delinking, namely the possibility that one jurisdiction decides to exit the linking agreement at a later stage. And here the problem is how to avoid delinking, as we observed in several cases described in this paper, Getting Married or Divorced, Or what are the possible effects of the linking, which I studied with this colleague in a paper on the possible effects of Brexit, entitled With or Without UK. Now, linking, I think, is a promising route, but it's a long-run strategy because it requires mutual trust. And mutual trust takes time and can be lost, as the linking cases show. So we need to find faster solutions because time is not on our side. And this may explain why Europe, but also other jurisdictions, are considering carbon border adjustment mechanisms. I think these adjustments are certainly theoretically reasonable. They are in line with Nordau's proposal of a carbon coalition, but theory and practice are not the same. And here the problem is how to implement it in practical terms, especially in a WTO compatible way. I see the risk of running into retaliation problems, and I think we should absolutely avoid trade wars and big anti-neighbor policies, especially during a pandemic. So as you see, none of these solutions is really a silver bullet, and all of them include a strategic component between regulators and firms or across the different governments, which calls for a game theoretical approach. I think there is room for more game theory to study these problems, and this is what we try to do in a recent paper, which considers the dichotomic choice of a regulated firm, whether to stay or to leave, delocalize the production. So let me wrap up and get to the conclusions. I think climate neutrality raises our ambition, but imposes more stringent policies, which rise carbon prices. On the one hand, the increasing carbon prices increases the impact on firms and households, which raises distributional and competitiveness concerns, and also problems of social acceptability of high carbon prices. On the other hand, it leads to larger incentive to innovation, to behavioral changes, and more importantly, to auction revenues. More than 57 billion euros were raised through auction revenues in Europe from 2012. And I think that the use of these auction revenues will be key for the future because it allows to mitigate losses, address the distribution aspects, and also fund the low carbon innovations through various funds in Europe, like innovation or the modernization fund. So going back to the initial question, I believe that ETS can be a key tool to accelerate and finance the sustainable transition, but not alone. There are other priorities, other things to be done. There are companion policies that need to be implemented, but also at the international level, we need to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, deliver on the promised transfer of the mobilization goal, and address the debt sustainability problem of developing countries. If we manage to do that, then if we do our own homework, let's say, and we find a way to make the process inclusive, then I believe that Glasgow could be actually a new climate Bretton Woods. So the start of a new economic order that is hopefully climate neutral indeed. So I'll stop here and leave room then to next speakers and to your questions.
Thank you very much, Simone. That was excellent. Thank you for identifying the shortcomings of the emissions trading systems and what further can be done to enhance these. Our last speaker for the session today is Professor Chung. If he's here with us today, he can join right away.
Hello.
Hello, Professor Zhang. The floor is all yours.
I would like to express my special thanks to Marc Uzan for inviting me to this very important session. As I'm delivering a recorded message, I try to be very brief and concise, and I hope to have your kind understanding that my proposals might need further elaborations. The first point I would like to present this morning is that in order to achieve sustainable economic system or sustainable development goals and a net zero 2050, we cannot no longer delay internalizing carbon price into our market. The free market has been brilliant in building up high carbon economic system without internalizing carbon price and mainly focusing on short-term economic productivity. But now is the time that we have to improve the functioning of our market towards a long-term environmental and social sustainability. IRENA once issued a report that we need to internalize $190 of carbon price into our market in order to stabilize climate change at 2 degrees Celsius. Internalizing such a high level of carbon price may not be easy, but it is very encouraging that recently there are many reports arguing that we have to internalize a carbon price into our functioning of our market. Free market has been free from environmental and social sustainability for a long time, but I think now free market has to be transformed or improved to be a sustainable market to deliver long-term sustainability goals. My second point is that in order to internalize carbon price into our market, I think we need to change our negative perception that carbon price or carbon tax is a big burden and cost on economy. We have been hearing so many reports and arguments presented by the conventional economists that investing in climate mitigation and renewable energy will reduce our economic growth in the long run. But personally, I didn't believe that this is the case. This is why I've been promoting the paradigm of green economic growth and green growth, which means that investing in climate can be a driver of economic growth rather than reducing economic growth. This is why I started this green growth idea from 2005 as a director in the UN ESCAP in Bangkok. I'm very glad that nowadays World Bank, OECD, and many other institutions and experts are joining forces in green growth knowledge platform and promoting the idea of green growth. In Seoul, we have even Global Green Growth Institute promoting the green growth idea around the world. And the third point I'd like to present this morning is that we mean that the environmental economists supporting the climate action needs to join our forces to present the case of new climate economics. I know that the new climate economy report has been published since 2012 and arguing that investing in climate can be a driver of economic growth and job creation. Recently, OECD and IRENA, the Renewable Energy Agency, is coming up with an analysis that investing in renewable energy can be a driver of job growth and economic growth and job creation. This is very interesting and encouraging, but we need to institutionalize this kind of anecdote into an economic principle that can be a basis for new climate economics. For this, I'd like to present one idea as a concrete tool to realize the synergy between climate and the economic growth. The ecological tax reform has been discussed for a long time in OECD to deliver a double dividend by increasing tax on pollution and emission, at the same time reducing income tax, thus maintaining a tax revenue neutrality, and arguing that this ecological tax reform can deliver double dividend of creating or increasing income and while reducing the carbon emission. I think that this is a very interesting proposition, and we need to further elaborate and come up with a more concrete recipe how we can apply this ecological tax reform ideas into practice. The European countries, many of the countries in Europe has been pioneering this experiment, especially Germany has experimented from 1999 to 2003, and presented a very positive outcome. So this kind of best practices should be further analyzed and spread out around the world, not only in Europe, especially countries like Korea or the United States or Japan, where this idea is very much unheard of. So this was my third point, strengthening the establishment of new climate economics, and the environmental economists has to join forces to send out the positive messages that climate change and investing in climate can be a driver of long-term economic growth and job creation. My third point is that we need to take a more flexible position on fiscal sustainability about government debt ratio issue. The conventional economist has been strongly arguing that government debt has to be strictly controlled, has to be kept at a minimum, and otherwise it might stimulate inflation and it will be threatening the long-term economic sustainability. But when the financial system was melted down in 2008, and the government has been coming up with a quantitative easing to save the financial system or banking business. But when government tried to take a flexible position regarding the fiscal sustainability or quantitative easing for coronavirus pandemic responses, or the fiscal flexibility for increasing net zero investment, there is always a strong argument and opposition based on the fiscal sustainability argument and doctrine, that especially in the case of Korea, our government debt ratio is running around 46% of GDP, which has been increased from 43% during the last 3 years. But there has been strong argument from the conventional economists and the businesses arguing that increasing government debt is a recipe for economic disaster in the long run, and that they have been strongly opposing any kind of government proactive leadership in increasing investment for climate change or even for coronavirus pandemic responses. So I think for me, I'm very much interested in modern monetary theory, which is taking a very interesting proposition that government can be taking a proactive leading role in mobilizing and providing quantitative easing or finances for green investment. I think this idea has been very much discussed in the United States and by the Biden government, as well as especially in Europe for Green Deal policy. But this kind of approach has not been very much spread out, countries like in Korea and others. So I think the more flexible position regarding the fiscal sustainability and the getting away from strict doctrine of controlling the government debt ratio might be another issue that we need to think about and we can discuss further in making our economic system and financial system to be more sustainable, so that the government can take a more proactive leading role in mobilizing finances for net zero 2050 investment. This is my 4 messages this morning, and I thank you very much for your kind understanding.
Okay, thanks very much to Professor Chung, who has joined us today with a recorded message. So we don't have much time left, so I will jump right away to questions. And I think I want to address a question to all 3 speakers today who are live here with us today. So that question has to do with the redistributive policies. So to what extent we can think this can be effective in preventing the possibility that unbalanced transitions to non-carbon economies can lead to time inconsistent policies, especially in the low and middle income countries? That's one part of the question. The other part is how can we design or redesign these policies, whether at national, international, or supranational level, to ensure, as much as possible, a sustainable transition. So perhaps, Michael, you want to take the lead on that, and then we can go around.
Yeah, I think happy to. And I think there's several dimensions of that. Well, I guess item one is, let's just focus domestically for a second. All transitions are disruptive, and and it's not very difficult to figure out that some people are going to be sideswiped in the whole thing. So in addition to the investment program, I think there has to be redistribution programs. Think of them as buffer shocks and so on, or support programs for people to make transitions. A friend of mine, a well-known economist, from Poland said, we got a lot of people in the coal industry, and we're going to phase that out. And that's a political issue, but it's also, a distributional challenge. And then all of us have talked about the international dimension of this. I think the one thing I would say, that this came out in Glasgow and to some extent in Tim's presentation, is it's not reasonable to expect, if you get past net zero and start looking at the precise paths the countries are going to take, it's not reasonable to expect all of them to take the same paths. So, I mean, last time I looked, the US, Canada, Australia were way out of line on per capita emissions. I think we ought to go faster. We have the resources. Europe's better, but they're in a kind of leadership position, as Simone said, in a number of dimensions. India announced net zero to everybody's surprise, but in 2070, I think that's perfectly reasonable. India is, so you have most of us at 2050, China at 2060, India at 2070. When you look at their per capita incomes and how much growth, and energy production that they're going to need to achieve their development objectives, those are at least consistent with the notion that the international consensus we all hope emerges is sensitive, to where they are in the growth and development process.
Thank you, Michael. Can we go around to Tim and Simone? Tim.
Yeah, thanks very much, John. And I'm following on from Michael's comments, which I strongly agree with. A couple of additional aspects to that. We do look at the employment impacts of transitions. Many more net jobs are created. Many more jobs are created in clean sectors than are lost in those in decline. But of course, those are not necessarily in the same parts of countries, or indeed in countries in general.
Right.
So these impacts have to be managed very carefully. I think one aspect of that is, is clearly in the coal sector. That's where you will feel it first, and that's where you will feel it most acutely. You have sort of communities, regions that are heavily dependent on a single industry, and that will require a sustained commitment from governments and financial institutions to try and manage some of those impacts. It's really not simple. Conscious of that, we did set up a sort of global commission to try and think through some of these social and economic aspects of this. It was chaired by the Prime Minister of Denmark, but co-chaired by Senegal. And there we came up with some recommendations that we released last week as to how you can try and what policies have been deployed in different parts of the world to manage distributional impacts at sort of national level. But I wanted to come back also on the international dimension, because I think it's absolutely crucial. Because we've got ourselves now into a situation, at least in the public debate in advanced economies, that there's a new kind of gold standard for climate action, and it's 2050. And that applies regardless of your state of development or where you're starting from. And I think we need to push back against that, because I don't think it's a reasonable way to interpret what needs to be done. Advanced economies need to move first, they need to move fastest, and they do need to, reach out and help countries to come along the way. Again, China has a particular position in this discussion, so I won't go there for the moment. But there is an enormous deficit in terms of the starting point and in terms of the steepness of the trajectory that needs to be, achieved by many developing economies. And we need to keep that in mind, and that they will need more time. that they will need additional assistance from a sort of international catalysts to bring down those costs of capital and help capital flows come in. It's not reasonable to assume that they can be judged by the same yardstick as everyone else. And so if you want to achieve global net zero emissions by 2050, then in our view, advanced economies need to be thinking about a date in advance of that and really helping others to come along the way.
Thank you very much, team. Simone.
Yes, John, I have to say I can only echo Tim and Michael on this. I will add that there is this domestic and international dimension of distribution, which in my view is really crucial for the success of what we do. Because if I look at from Europe, at the moment, Europe, as Michael was saying, plays a leader role. But even within Europe, the increase in energy prices, I feel is creating troubles with people saying, okay, we go for some leadership that is very costly. And the only way to, I mean, this will be a test, a real test on the ETS for our policies. And the only way is to have distribution policies that clarify that the revenues that are raised are used for redistribution policies. And the same applies at the international level. I fully agree with what Tim was saying. We cannot expect to be on the same ground at the same speed as the others, but we can use, for instance, climate finance or other instruments to make them move along the way they need to. And probably they will move faster than they actually commit to right now. So I'm a bit optimistic on this side, but picking up one word that I heard in the question, time consistency. Well, we need to be time consistent, because if we will do, then also the market will help the process. If not, we know from Barrow Gordon and the whole literature there that we run into a failure.
Thank you very much, Simone. Although we all appreciate that being time consistent when dealing with politicians is not the easiest of things to accomplish. But thanks very much for this. This was a great comment. We came to the end of the first session. That was fantastic. Thank you all very much for these insightful contributions. I think we come out of this session wiser. What I take from all this is that there is a need, certainly a great need for policy coordination across nations, and that we're going to have to accept some sort of a different tier system in terms of the transitions, depending on the level of development of countries. So thank you all very much. It was a pleasure having you. We hope we can see you again soon in the future. Enjoy the rest of your days, and please do join other sessions if you're interested. Thank you very much. Thank you again.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Tim,
Bye-bye.
Simone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Second session of our conference today. I'm Ronnie McDonald. I'm a research professor of macroeconomics and international finance in the Adam Smith Business School. I have a keen interest in the post-COVID economy and also sustainable economic development. Again, we've got four terrific speakers in this session. The session's entitled Macroeconomic Impacts of Climate Change, the Case for a Green Recovery from the COVID-19 Pandemic. Now, I'm going to introduce the speakers sequentially. And as our first housekeeping rule, I'd like to ask speakers to ensure their cameras and mics are off if they're not actually speaking. It just gives a better experience for those tuning into the conference. My second housekeeping point is, could I also ask attendees to direct any questions to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen? that would be very helpful. So if you've got questions as we go along, these can be accumulated in the chat box, and we'll spend some time at the end answering these questions. Okay, so let's get down to business. Our first speaker today is Ian Gould. Ian's Professor of Globalization and Development at the University of Oxford. He's the founding director of the Oxford Martin School, and he's also a former Vice President of the World Bank, former Chief Executive Managing Director of the Development Bank of South Africa, and advisor to Professor Nelson Mandela. So can I hand over to you, Ian?
Thanks very much, Ronald. It's a great pleasure to be participating in this with such a great panel, and to think about, in the context of momentous events happening in Glasgow as we speak, how the transition to net zero could create a better economy. This is of vital importance at the moment because the experience from previous crises is that the stimulus packages which are provided in response to these can greatly exacerbate emissions. In fact, what we saw of the financial crisis in 2008-9 was that the lull in greenhouse gas emissions that had been experienced during the crisis as economic output declined bounced way beyond what it had been before. And so the great danger is that stimulus is spent on infrastructure, on steel, on cement, and leads to greater consumption, and of course through that much greater greenhouse gas emissions, but also use of plastics and other pollutants. So how to design a transition to net zero while recovering from the pandemic, while ensuring that we overcome what's been, I think, the most devastating long-term legacy of the pandemic, very rapidly rising inequality within countries and between countries. This pandemic is likely to go down in history as the pandemic that caused the greatest development disaster the world's ever experienced. The World Bank estimates over 150 million people have been thrown into desperate poverty as a result of the pandemic. The second order impacts, people not being able to work, people not being receiving remittances from migrants and others, which have always been counter-cyclical in the past, and the second order effects in terms of reduced revenues from tourism, from travel, and lower investment volumes. This is particularly the case in low and middle income countries, but the inequalities have also widened, both in terms of health and in terms of economic outcomes in the OECD economies. The temporary provisional stimulus or furlough schemes of stimulus checks is being wound down now, and so we're seeing this rapid peak up, particularly amongst those that remain out of work. So the design of a transformation which both provides the transition to net zero and is able to address the needs of the majority of populations and address international solidarity is absolutely vital. Starting on the international front, my view is that this needs necessarily to include a new debt restructuring package. It needs to be agreed, because what we've seen, because of the rise of credit rating agencies' significance and the need for private finance, is that the existing forbearance has not been effective. And so virtually all developing countries are at the absolute limits of their fiscal space, and they cannot provide the support. So while the rich countries have found $20 trillion for themselves in stimulus, in furloughs, in support for compensating for the impact of the pandemic, less than 1% of that has been available to developing countries, and there's been much less global solidarity than in the past. In fact, many countries, including, sadly, the UK, have cut aid. The UK has cut aid by about 1/3 at a time when it's never been more needed. So the SDGs have been totally derailed, and that needs to be a priority of repositioning while achieving the transition to net zero. My carbon produced anywhere is carbon which is contributing on other greenhouse gases to climate change. And so it's most cost effective and efficient to reduce carbon in places where that's cheapest, and that is notably in developing countries. And so what of vital significance, and there's been a trial of this agreed at COP of $8.6 billion transferred to South Africa to close coal power stations. This, in my view, is very significant, but needs to be greatly scaled. We need hundreds of billions of dollars going beyond what was agreed in Paris, and that is a way of creating a just transition. The people who are losing their jobs in coal sectors, in mining of different types of iron ore, etc., and working in power stations and the associated industries like the truckers, they need to be compensated. And the only way to do this is, I believe, to create a just transition, to give people the skills they need, to give people the pensions they need, the mobility vouchers they need to get to where jobs will be in the future. That is international solidarity, which will both be in the interests of development and the climate transition. At home in the advanced economies, my view is we need much more action. We need carbon taxes, which reflect the two spillovers. This has to be well over $50 per ton. At that price, by the way, transferring money to developing countries through carbon offset schemes, which need to be made to work, need to be transparent, and need to be accountable, which they are not at the moment, whether one is flying or whether one is offsetting carbon domestically through cement or other needs. These need to be offset schemes for reforestation, for the closing of coal power stations, etc., which are globally accountable. That mechanism is not in place. There needs to, in addition to be carbon taxes, very rapid increase in subsidies, the rollout of infrastructure, including charging points for electric vehicles, highway transformations for electric vehicles, and much needed refitting of gas and electrical systems, particularly gas, in heating, domestic, industrial, and others. These are massive investment needs which need to be paid for by tax. And my view is we need to learn from the experience of the Second World War. Tax rates are going to have to go up in addition to closing all the loopholes, global and domestic, in that respect. I think I've taken enough time for my initial comments and look forward to hearing my colleagues' comments and of coming back in the questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian. That was a super introduction. Sets out some of the key points, and I think you're absolutely right to emphasize the importance of inequality, which has been, as you say, greatly exacerbated during the pandemic, and it is a kind of twin with the whole climate change issue that we really have to address going forward, I think. Thanks very much. Okay, so we'll move on to our next speaker now, please. Our next speaker is Dibak Dasgupta. Dibak is the founding board member of the Green Climate Fund and chair facilitator of its investment committee. He's a distinguished fellow of TRI India, winner of the Adam Smith Prize at Cambridge, and a former principal economic advisor to the government India. And he also established its climate finance unit. So over to you now, Dibak. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just try to see if I can bring my screen up. Okay. I hope you can see what I have, which is a lovely picture of the planet from a very North America point of view. Chair, can you see? Confirm?
Yes, yes, we can. Thanks. Yeah, we can see that.
Great. Okay. So thanks, everyone. I'm very happy to be joining this meeting. Thanks to Marc and the Adam Smith Business School for being here. And this morning is just heard Ian Gould talk about many issues that's going on, the big inequalities, And I think yesterday was also money day at where you are, or where some of us are not there, but the meetings at COP26. There's always that ancient trade fair game or practice of trying to spot where the money is. And the reality is that climate finance needs to rise by approximately 5 to 7 times very, very quickly. And it's not been happening for the last decade. It's been rising, but the rate is around globally about measured to the extent that we can measure these things, about $700 billion annually, give or take. And it's about the same size as the money going to fossil fuels. So that tells us we still have a problem. We need to cut emissions by 45% during this next 10 years, or we lose the 1.5C, the holding, limiting the temperature increase to 1.5 will be impossible without. Just to give a sense of perspective of how big that challenge is, that's like having during the pandemic, the cut in emissions that happened because economies were shutting down across the world was roughly around 5.8%. That was the impact of the pandemic. So to get to a 45% cut in 10 years, imagine that we would have to have a similar scalable effect as the pandemic, equivalent to the pandemic happening almost every other year, if not more, over the next 10 years. And these are permanent effects that we need to see. So clearly we are in some trouble of how to get there. And on top of that, of course, the pandemic, it leaves us as far as we can tell about pandemics in the past, and every pandemic is different, and this one also leaves decades of impacts. And one thing that has happened is, as Ian was talking about, is the impacts on every level. So this one was a double impact. It was both a health impact and it was an economic impact. And this economic impact will last a long time. So how do we scale up finance, climate finance post-pandemic? What do we need to do? We heard in the previous session about policy coordination. We're living in a multiple equilibrium world, and let's try to see if we can find where these. So I start with the proposition that public guarantees to accelerate and scale up climate finance in post-pandemic context is going to be absolutely crucial. We see no other way. And we had run through what are public guarantees, what do they achieve? Why do we need public guarantees for climate as the only possible answer? And how do we design a mechanism to get there? And there's a very recently published paper with my co-authors, Jean-Charles Hourcade and Frédéric Gould. It's called Accelerating the Speed and Scale of Climate Finance in the Post-Pandemic Context, just out in Climate Policy. So first question, why? It's interesting to recall, how did we develop the COVID-19 vaccine? It was essentially about governments taking entire risk and more to develop that, and as quite rightly so. Governments eliminated market risk with grants and guarantees. They used advanced purchase agreements. BARDA, they had a special setup with the Biomedical Research and Development Authority in the US leading the way, spent about 19 billion. Larger total spent prior to the pandemic was about 40 billion, so we were well ready. Advanced purchases and contracts were given out to all the companies, which was around, this was the advanced manufacturing facility. Even before the vaccines is developed, they were working about warp speed advanced, which was the next phase, was these advanced actual purchases. There was no delivery. We didn't know whether the vaccines would be developed. It came at 6 billion, went to Pfizer, 5 billion to, and 1 billion to Johnson & Johnson. EU possibly spent another 5 to 6 billion, UK spent. So we're talking about massive sums of advanced contracts, essentially in the nature of guarantees. Companies retained their patent rights, prices and contracts were secret. So if you can imagine, public is taking on all the risks. They're providing supreme guarantees to the pharmaceutical companies, and COVAX is, of course, now placing orders for the missing vaccines in developing countries. So massive risks entirely underwritten by the public sector. Profits go to the private companies. That's how it was done when there was a acute, that's how we get the vaccines going. EU recovery and resilience plan that's going on currently. It's a 750 billion euro plan, includes green transition, 500 billion in grants, 250 billion in low-cost loans, expected multiplier from the European, the strategic investments around 15 times. There's a 15 times is the expected investment impacts from the guarantees, expected bounce of 1.5% to GDP growth. Point is, again, another case of massive guarantees, state role being brought out, clear breaks with precedents. EU didn't ever provide this scale and size of grants and guarantees with its own resources, common debt, and a green agenda. Fiscal sustainability of the entire exercise expected because of exceptionally low interest rates and costs, driving interest rates because of the secular stagnation that's pretty obvious around the place. So third example of what are the kinds of guarantees and do they work on a scalable basis. USAID, Development Credit Authority, has been executing essentially a guarantee program for decades now. 3.1 billion in credit guarantees given to primarily in small-scale industries and other activities in sub-Saharan Africa. Default rate, the one worry that is that there's always there, but this is like the scaremongering that the state guarantees must be defaulting at very high rates because of the moral hazard risks. It doesn't actually provide, the evidence doesn't suggest that. Default rate from the USAID Credit Authority was 1.85% across 71 countries and largely started in sub-Saharan Africa. Loan guarantees have been around a huge part. So you're guaranteeing entire loan portfolios, portable guarantee commitment letters, bond guarantees, entire scale of, entire range of guarantees in a sense. And this, by the way, is being experienced with the USAID credit guarantee. It's now being followed in the Millennium Challenge Corporation is doing similar things now with its policy guarantees and conditions, with some conditions precedent about agreements on policies. GCF, Global Climate Finance, has started exactly the same route in Vietnam. They've just done a $75 million guarantee program expected to generate 250 billion additional credit. And this is a program that's being run by the World Bank using the much guarantees from Green Climate Fund and the spillover impacts. That's a really interesting one. The reason it's happening is the spillover impacts of about 11 gigawatts of avoided generating capacity. So essentially, we think there is a role for guarantees. It's a proven role. The question is, how do we do it? And sovereign and public guarantees are therefore very powerful instruments to encourage private finance at turning points of high risk. I will not go into the history, long history from the Suez Canal to the railways to electrification to, as we've just seen, COVID-19, when massive system transitions are needed. We talked about the scale of the problem on climate finance. There's no other way that we know of how to do it. Implicit or explicit guarantees, even our modern fractional banking system relies on that. For developed to developing, it's not really from developed countries to developing countries, it's from financial investment centers, where the money is, the world savings to. And there's 6 reasons. Weighted average cost of capital. We run these integrated energy assessment models, and they actually do not have a differentiation in cost of capital, 2 to 10 times higher in developing countries. Yet the cost of cutting a ton of carbon is 1/2 in developing countries. 2/3 of the mitigation has to happen in developing countries. World is awash in excess savings, and that's why I'm not I'm not surprised to see a whole lot of investors with $130 trillion coming to the meetings yesterday at COP26, promising to do things which I don't buy it till without state playing a role. Post-pandemic situation, and the only way is to back sovereign-backed AA, AAA rated sovereign guarantees to de-risk and back private investment across borders. I'm getting close to finishing. What kind of mechanism might work? It needs to be multi-sovereign, 15 times multiplier possible, test different models, set parameters, provide policy assurance in host countries, never guarantee too much, but work with changing operational parameters is crucial. OECD right now, the arrangements in place actually don't permit guarantees. And therefore, blended finance is only 5% of multilateral agency climate financing. We got to shift directions from direct project lending. Everyone loves direct project lending. We want the finance agencies to back away from direct lending. They should go back to their original roles, shift to blended finance guarantees. MDBs will not or cannot do it because of various inertia practices of the past, and shift the operational parameters of MDBs, would generate jobs, incomes, everything. Thank you very much. And I hope I've not strayed over too much beyond the 10 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Deepak. That was a fantastic overview of these issues of scaling up in terms of finance. And I thought the vaccine illustration you gave was particularly apposite at this time. Thank you. So we move on to the next speaker now. Our next speaker is Alexander Shirov. He's a member of the board of the VEO of Russia. He's also director of the Institute for Economic Forecasting of the Russian Academy of Sciences and a corresponding member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. So if I could hand over to you, Alexander, now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like to share my presentation. See you, my PowerPoint presentation. Alex.
Yes, we can see you. Thank you.
Okay. The main problem in global decarbonization is conflict of interest between developing and developed countries. And in my presentation, I'd like to show position of our country, developing country, Russia, and some words about our position in this. The largest economy by territory and the country with a large area of forests. In this slide, you can see that the 2018, the reduction of greenhouse gases in Russia amounted to 49%. Our country is a world champion for this parameter in this period. But our paid for this record with several economic downturn in the 90s. The structure of Russian economy, in current structure of Russian economy, is very similar with economic structure in, for example, in European Union or Great Britain. We have about 50% of GDP households, about 20% for investment, but sometimes the production of raw materials, oil, gas, coal, is very important for formation of primary incomes in Russian economy. Very interesting that Russia has the low carbon power sector. In this slide, you can see that our carbon intensity in electricity sector in Russia, like as European Union, and better than in United States, Japan, Korea, China, India, and so on. By the way, the share of electric transport in Russia is also the largest among the major countries in the world. And of course, for us, very important, the share of nuclear and hydro energy in structure of our electricity. In this slide, you can see the main factors of decreasing decarbonization of Russian economy for the last 30 years. For example, 30% reduction of energy intensity, 15% reduction of carbon intensity in energy consumption, and 3% of reduction in population. Over the past 30 years, these factors have reduced CO2 emissions by 27%, despite an increased GDP per capita in 25%. National climate in Russia being actively developed. We need the average GDP growth rates in about 3%. It's above the world economy. It's necessary to have competitiveness of our economy in the world. The second way is, of course, our commitment in the Paris Agreement, and the last Russian law go in these directions. For example, in end of October, Russian president was approved the strategy of social economic development with low level of greenhouse gas emissions until 2050. Also, the following things have been improved. For example, taxonomy of green finance, concept for the development of production and use of electric, road transport, concept of hydrogen energy development. In our institute, we work about different scenarios of decarbonization for Russian economy, and in this work we use different models and toolkits. In the core of our system of models is macrostructural model based on input-output tables and balance of greenhouse gases emissions. And of course, the main idea is create scenario in which we have low carbon emission and high growth rates for economy. In this slide, you can see how we estimate the impact of international climate policy on the Russian export. In this case, in Paris Agreement scenario, we have low in gas and more in natural gas. But if we look at the average growth rates for Russian export, you can see that this export grows more than or decline less than world demand, because we mean that Russian oil, gas, and natural gas and coal are more competitiveness. Finally, you can see a couple of scenarios for decarbonization for Russian economy. And all these scenarios you can see in terms of GDP growth rates and net zero period of net Russian economy. And you can see that scenario is moderate technological decarbonization plus forests. We estimate about 3% average growth rates, and net zero is possible in 2060. If you know, the Russian president was declared this point 2060 for net zero for Russian economy, and for our understanding, this scenario is possible for Russian economy because the growth rate is about 3%, and technical changes is very useful for Russian economy, for Russian business, and for Russian government. In this slide, you can see the structural and technological climate goals, because the green sector in this graph is a contribution from the forests, and of course project problem for Russian science, not only for Russian, but it's necessary to collaborate with European and world scientists in the field of estimation, observation for Russian forests and another activities. So it's all. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, Alexander. That's a very helpful perspective on Russia's role in getting us to net zero. Thanks very much. I now hand over to our final speaker in this session, to Professor Jean Pisani-Ferry, who is the Tommaso Padoa Scioppa Chair at the European University Institute in Florence. He's the co-founder and senior fellow at Bruegel, the European think tank. He's also professor of economics at Sciences Po in Paris, and a former Commissioner General of France Strategy, the Ideas Lab of the French government. He's also contributed to President Macron's successful presidential bid, and he was his director of program and ideas during the campaign. Okay, thank you, and over to you now, Jean.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well, because the previous speaker was a bit difficult to hear. I hope my connection is okay. What I'm going to do, hopefully briefly in this presentation, is to discuss how we think about the cost of mitigation. I think it's becoming a significant issue, because we're moving from a perspective where climate change mitigation was regarded as a sort of a long-term goal, so was regarded as something for future generations, towards a perspective in which it's becoming a much more immediate policy priority, and therefore much more something with much more immediate economic impact. And there has been a sort of a lack of sufficient, in my view, macro analysis of what it can imply. So let me start by offering a way to think about this issue. we're all familiar with this notion that along a transition path towards decarbonization, we have on the one hand the abatement costs that are there, that are unavoidable, but we have the limitation of the damages, which are the benefits. So it's a sort of cost-benefit analysis, and clearly, I mean, at least from a collective perspective, there's no doubt that priority should be given to mitigation, and that the benefit from successful mitigation outweighed by large margin the cost. Now there is a whole discussion on the appropriate speed, but basically that's within this framework. What's happened, I think, is first a piece of good news that we've realized that some of these costs, at least, are less significant than initially thought because of the speed at which technical progress has reduced the cost of renewables, for example, but also batteries, etc. And this is what innovation economists told us 15 years ago when they said we're looking at this problem based on the assumption that technical progress is exogenous, but in fact it is endogenous. And once you start putting the emphasis on reducing emission, on decarbonization, then you are going to unleash the innovation machine, and the innovation machine is going to produce the expected results. And this is happening, and this is very good news. Now, what's less a piece of good news is the question of speed. Now, we're realizing that we're not, and that's very much the focus of the conference, we're not on track to sufficiently fast reduction of emission. And we are realizing that the damage of not achieving the containment of the rise in temperature to 1.5 degrees are higher than initially anticipated. So basically what we've got to do, and this is very much what's, again, the focus of the conference, but for example, what the EU is doing with this new Green Deal plan, is to transition from one path, decarbonization path, to another one, to a lower one, and to transition very fast. So basically to accelerate the pace of decarbonization, in the case of Europe, by a factor 3, achieving the minus 55% in 2030. So this means that we have to transition from one path to another one. And this is a macro problem, because this means that part of the capital stock, the existing capital stock, will need to be put aside before it reaches the end of its economic life. This is a clearly negative supply shock. This is going to reduce potential output. And this is on top of that a reallocation shock, with all the reallocation away from carbon-intensive sectors towards non-carbon intensive sectors that has to be taking place. And this is not exclusively coal mining, but this is, for example, the whole of the auto industry. This is part of manufacturing. This is agriculture. I mean, this covers a large range of sectors. And this macro cost is significant. So if we take the example of the metaphor of a supply shock, the simple calculation I've made is just to say, let's assume the price of carbon goes from where it is, which is close to zero globally, to where we're told it should be, $75 per ton, according to the Stiglitz-Stern report of 2017, which is not on the high end of available estimates. If you just multiply the volume of global emission by this price, or the increase in price, you're getting to something like 3% of global GDP. And 3% of global GDP is very close to the impact of the first oil shock, when the price of oil was increased sharply in the early 70s. And we know then from experience that this increase in the price of oil, the supply shock, had significant adverse macro consequences. So there are a number of factors which make the shock we're facing not exactly, comparable to the oil shock of the 70s. So I could give the detail, but there are some mitigation factors. But nevertheless, it's a supply shock, and so we should be sort of clear and honest about the nature of this shock, what it implies, and not pretend that just by adding new investment, we're going to offset completely the supply shock, and that in fact the transition to net zero will be expansionary and good for jobs, unless we assume there are massive slack in the economy, which is not exactly the situation in which many of our economies are at present. So that with one cost. Now let me more briefly go through two other costs. One is the cost of insufficiently credible policies, and this is a significant one because there is a commitment. This commitment, is made, and we know from the scenarios of the IEA and many others that the actual policies are not in line with these commitments, and that the actual. So the miracle of the Paris Agreement has been that the private sector believes that something important is going on, that there's a shift in policies, and that this justifies investing in a carbon neutral or non-carbon intensive technologies. And this is what we've seen developing in recent years, both in terms of investment, in terms of market signal, in terms of market valuations, etc. But all that hinges on the credibility of the commitment and the credibility of the policies. Now, if these policies are not credible, we know that the cost is going to be much higher, because it means that on the private side, they're going to be a disincentive to invest in brown technologies, and a disincentive to invest that try to sort of find out what the cost of insufficiently credible policies, and it is significant. And finally, the last cost we are speaking of is the cost of inefficient policies, meaning policies that do not proceed through prices or do not proceed through regulation that give the right signal to the private sector, but on the contrary, proceed to a sort of mixture of instruments, including subsidies, because it's easier to do than to give strong signal on what shouldn't be done. And this combination of policies, including policies that on one hand subsidize, and on the other hand pretend the cost of the transition is further increased. So I think the challenge ahead of us is, and let me conclude with that, is first to be clear about the nature of the transition, and not to tell public opinion, and not to tell governments, and not to tell businesses that it's an easy transition. It's a difficult transition because of the acceleration, and the fact that this acceleration implies inevitably some significant macroeconomic costs. The second thing I think we should be emphasizing is the fact that insufficiently credible policies and insufficiently effective or efficient climate policies are to be avoided to the extent possible, and that there is this macro costs are not avoidable because of the need to move much faster than anticipated. That's in a way that the price of procrastination, and we've got to pay the price of procrastination, but we don't have necessarily to pay the price of insufficient credibility and the price of inefficient policies. Let me end here.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. Particularly appreciated the point about the supply side nature of the shock that we face going forward. I think that's a really important point in the debate. Okay, so we now have some time for some general questions. Perhaps I could kick off by asking, perhaps all of our speakers could now rejoin us, please. I think what's coming across here clearly in terms of a general point is the sheer magnitude and scale of the, of what's ahead of us if we're going to get to the Paris Accord targets. We've heard this from various angles, the scale of inequality that we face, and the debt restructuring that Ian mentioned. We've got the huge issues of scaling up in terms of finance that was mentioned by Deepak, and we've heard of the huge costs that Zhang has just mentioned. So, in a political economy sense, do you think we can get to the Paris Accord targets in time, or is this really an impossible task, and we have to recognize it's an impossible task at this stage? And where do we go if it is? So perhaps I could ask Ian first of all for his thoughts on this.
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks to my fellow panelists. I learned a lot from their contributions. I think the biggest challenge we face is the growing tensions between the US and China. The two of them are basically at the heart of anything that's going to be agreed globally, and a new Cold War would totally stymie any successful attempts to stick to 1.5. So I never thought I would say this again in my lifetime, but I wish Kissinger were back in the White House. And that is because he knew how to be tough on China in private and respectful, which you need to be in public. And that's a very dangerous situation. I think Biden losing Virginia 2 days ago and the midterm elections coming up in the US make the prospects of toning down the rhetoric on China more unlikely for him. It's the only thing he seems to be able to get bipartisan support for. And so that worries me more than anything else in terms of reaching Paris. Then, of course, there's the question of, even if they did agree, what about some other players? But I think Europe is fine. I think Europe would advance very effectively. I think it'll do it anyway. And so then you get some big players, Russia, India, Brazil, some other big players becoming significant. But basically, it's got to start with the US and China. And that's what worries me most. So I think the prospects of that are low. And so I don't think we can achieve the 1.5 in the sort of aggressive way that Zhang has eloquently illustrated is a massive, and Deepak highlighted in terms of whatever it is, 9 times the pandemic cuts, is a massive undertaking, even with goodwill.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. That's very helpful. Deepak, perhaps I could ask for your thoughts on this next.
Yeah, thanks. I think Ian and others are absolutely right. The size of it, is it impossible? I think I'll break it up into 2 parts. One part is that if the required preconditions were to happen to switch to this size of transition, the co-benefits are actually extremely large. So there are co-benefits in terms of things that he can do on development much faster, things that he can do to get air quality improvements, things that he can do to expedite the benefits and diffusion of technology much faster. Low energy transitions happening in a continent the scale of Africa, if it gets connected to low carbon transition technologies and possibilities abundantly in place, you'll get a welfare kick out of this whole exercise, which is several times bigger than the direct benefits. So the costs are, yes, it's costly, but we have massive benefits in place. That's one side of the story. Second part of the story is, where are we hitting the bottlenecks? And the bottlenecks we're hitting is on international cooperation, and international cooperation. I think what is happening is that I think we understand it, but we're not being frank in terms of back to our constituencies. When we are back in our countries, we're telling one story at the COP26 and making it sound as it's not a big challenge. It is a huge challenge. So international cooperation will have to rework that framework. It's a plurality of governance. As Ian was saying, it's not only about getting China and the US, but it's also bringing on board everyone else to do the kind of shift. And finance is actually the key. If we can unlock the finance, because money is actually abundantly available. Technologies are abundantly available. So we need to push that lever much harder and be upfront. This is what it's going to take. Thanks. And by the way, we won't get the pace necessarily, but there is a way in which you move this.
Thanks very much.
Probably start slower, finish faster.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Alexander, are you able to come in at this point? I think you're on mute, Alexander.
From my point of view, the main challenge for our country is high capital intensity new technologies in the field of decarbonization. For example, the capital cost renewable energy is 2 times expensive in current prices for Russia than traditional gas or coal power plants modernization. And of course, this very high capital intensity for new technologies is a big problem. And of course, we have to make the balance between these very high prices for new technologies and level of GDP dynamics and household consumption and so on, so on, so on.
Thanks very much, Alexander. I've been told that your co-author, Boris Porefriev, has joined us, and I believe he wants to make a comment as well.
Thank you very much, Ronnie, for the permission just to participate. First of all, I would like to appreciate the brilliant presentation of all contributors. Thank you very much indeed. It was very interesting for both sessions. And 3 very brief comments. The comment on the last point, I buy the point by Dispatch Gus Gupta about this bottleneck of international, but I also believe there are some roadblocks within the countries on this national road. I mean, there are, well, certain disparities within different social groups and politicians. Not everybody is happy with moving very fast on this track, even if finance are available. I believe there should be certain agreement on this. There should be a national strategy. This is not true, by the way. There are, well, certain conflicts between the political forces and between different social groups within countries. So it's not full harmonization. I think that's some road is ahead on this point. The second point is, well, it was mentioned that mitigation is a priority. Well, I don't think so. I believe we should oversee adaptation as well. It looks like a granddaughter of the agenda, climate agenda now, stepdaughter. I think that adaptation should be more and more emphasized and financed. It's, by the way, very, very important for the developing countries and Russia inclusive, and I believe the developed countries as well. We should also allocate resources to adaptation, which should be done every day. And if, by the way, we consider the investments we need here, of course, there will be not 3% of the GDP, as Zhang mentioned. It should be more. And the last point is that all of these things, including carbon neutrality, should be considered with a more and more broader perspective of sustainable development, and all climate policy and net zero inclusive should be, so to say, mainstreamed into this sustainable development. From my perspective, it looks like that the point is a little bit overstressed. I believe there are well, certain challenges of the sustainable development which, so to speak, weigh more than this carbon zero goal. And it is especially important for the developing countries. So if we match all these things, if we try to find win-win solutions, I believe we'll really move faster. Let me just give one very short example. We mentioned one word, energy efficiency. If we really move this track, I believe we'll get more and more successful on both tracks, both on more rapid economic development and, of course, more sound climate policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Boris. That's a very helpful addition to our other conversations. If I could ask Zhang to give his comments or thoughts on this particular issue.
Sorry. Yes, I'll try to answer your question, but also the question in the chat by Sonar Baskaya saying, you know, are we going to see the COP being turned into something like the G20s with high initial expectation and then the disappointment about talking shops without concrete results? And I think that's a very real risk. That's what I meant by credibility. You know, you can easily have a sort of Davos type of meeting where everybody meets and talks, and in the end there's not much that's agreed. I mean, that it changed the game. I mean, it changed the game from a game that was expected to be exclusively governments negotiating binding agreements into something that combined government commitment and private sector. And that was successful. But I think it is fragile. It is fragile because, you know, just to take a concrete example, for an Audi that bets that they're going to transition to electric cars ahead of regulation, there's a BMW which is going slow, and you know, is not certain that the combustion engine is dead, and that's inevitably the attitude of business throughout the world. I think that's a big issue. It brings that by which is, I think, is the most important one, which is, you know, how do we bring in China and the US? At present, the message from Xi Jinping is very clear. The sort of written message to the conference is, you know, if you want to have me in, there are conditions and they're not met. And in fact, I agree. The US policy towards China does not create the conditions for a fruitful dialogue with China on this issue, which is surprising because the US strategists had clear views ahead of the election. I mean, if you go back to the papers by Jake Sullivan, they're very clear on the type of relationship they want to have with China. Now, that's not the message that's being sent, and that's a big risk. The other question, how can trade contribute? We had in recent days this EU-US agreement on steel and aluminium, which is a sort of strange combination of traditional managed trade with some mention of the carbon intensity and the fact that carbon intensity would be a criterion for deciding what to do, including with third countries. So are we seeing the sort of emergence of a quote unquote dirty climate club, not exactly the climate club that Nordhaus has in mind, or is this just a way to pretend that managed trade is sort of wrapped into a nicer approach to climate action? I don't know at this stage, but I think that's part of the questions.
Thanks very much for that. That was great. Well, we need to wrap up now. We've already overshot our allocated space here. I'd really like to thank everyone very much for their participation today and for their comments. I think this has been a brilliant session, if not perhaps slightly depressing session, but I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure those tuning in have as well. So thanks again, everybody. Much appreciated. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.